She was lying in the dirt when the helicopter came, not waiting for it, not praying toward the sound of the rotors cutting through the hot Afghan air. She was lying on her back with her left leg wrapped in a tourniquet. She had applied herself blood-soaking through the field, dressing in a slow dark bloom, and she was talking into the radio with the calm voice of someone reading a weather report. Callaway, take your 3 south. Use the dry creek bed. Stay low. The ridge on your left is clear. They watched it for 11 minutes, and there's nothing moving up there. Go now while the smoke is still thick. Static, then Callaway's voice rough and breathless. Merritt, are you? I'm fine, go. She was not fine, but fine was not the point. The helicopter came in low over the ridge. She watched it descend without moving, without reaching up, without making herself any easier to find. The rotors threw dust across her face. She closed her eyes against it, kept the radio pressed to her ear, and listened to the sound of her team moving to safety. When the last of them confirmed extraction, she let out one slow breath through her nose. Then she set the radio down in the dirt beside her and looked up at the pale morning sky over Helmand Province. She was 26 years old. She had both hands free. That was what she had planned for. That was what everything had cost. 15 years later, on a quiet Tuesday morning in rural Virginia, a retired rear admiral named Raymond Holt would open an envelope with no return address and read a document that would unravel everything he thought he knew about that day, about that woman, about what she had done and why she had done it and what it had taken from her, sure. But that morning came later. First, you have to understand who she was before anyone else did. Sloan Merritt grew up in Billings, Montana, in a house at the end of a gravel road where the winters came early and the wind had nothing to slow it down for 300 miles in any direction. Her father, Gunnery Sergeant Dale Merritt, was a Marine, the real kind, the kind who didn't talk about it at dinner, but whose hands you could read like a map if you knew what you were looking at, the calluses, the way he always sat with his back to the wall, the way he paused before answering any question that actually mattered, like he was checking the perimeter of his own thoughts before speaking. He started teaching her to shoot when she was 11 years old. Not because he wanted her to be a warrior. He was very clear about that. Because he told her one afternoon at the back of their property, standing behind a rusted fence post with a Remington 700 propped against it, the world is not always going to offer you a choice about what your hands need to do. And if that moment comes, I want you to be ready. I want your hands to know what to do, even when your brain is too scared to think straight. She was a fast learner. By the time she was 14, she was outscoring him on long-range paper. He never made a fuss about it. He just adjusted the targets out another 100 yards and said again. She learned to read wind by watching the grass. She learned bullet drop from a notebook he kept in the drawer of his workbench, full of numbers and corrections and conditions written in his cramped, left-handed print. She learned that breathing was everything, that the trigger was not pulled, but pressed, that patience was not a virtue in this context, but a physical skill, something you built like a muscle, something that failed when you let it go untrained. She learned all of it. And then in November of 2004, a notification team knocked on the door of the house at the end of the gravel road in Billings, Montana, and told her mother that Gunnery Sergeant Dale Merritt had been killed in action in Fallujah, Iraq. Sloan was 21 years old. Her mother, a quiet woman named Carol, who had spent 20 years learning to love a man who left every 18 months and came back different, stood in the doorway for a long time after the officers left. Sloan stood beside her. Neither of them cried right away. It wasn't the Merritt way. That night, after her mother had finally gone to bed, Sloan went out to the back of the property. She stood by the fence post in the dark. She did not bring a rifle. Her mother came to her 2 days later with a simple request delivered in the flat and exhausted voice of a woman who had already decided the answer before she asked the question. No more guns. Promise me. Whatever you do with your life, whatever you become, not that, not this. I cannot watch this again. Sloan promised. She meant it. She joined the Navy the following spring, became a corpsman, trained in emergency trauma medicine with the kind of focused intensity that her instructors noted in their evaluations as unusual for her age. She had steady hands. She stayed calm when other trainees froze. She had the rare ability to narrow her entire world to the problem directly in front of her and ignore everything else until that problem was solved. Nobody knew why. She never told them. By 2009, she had 2 deployments behind her, a service record with no gaps and no complaints, and 53 confirmed lives saved in combat conditions. No Purple Hearts. She had never been officially wounded. She had also not touched a firearm in 5 years. She kept that promise right up until the moment she had to break it. Helmand Province, July 2009. The heat hit like a physical object the moment you stepped off the aircraft. 112 degrees Fahrenheit in the early afternoon. The kind of heat that made metal too hot to touch and turned the air above the ground into a shimmer that bent the horizon into something untrustworthy. The kind of heat that killed you in layers: first, your judgment, then your patience, then your will. Operation Kanjar was in its third week, the largest Marine ground offensive since the initial invasion in 2001, sweeping through the Helmand River Valley in a coordinated push to disrupt Taliban logistics and deny them the poppy fields that funded half their operations. Thousands of troops on the ground, dozens of simultaneous operations running across a region the size of West Virginia. In the middle of all of that, a seven-man SEAL element from Devgru was moving through a dry valley 12 kilometers northeast of the town of Marja, assigned to locate and mark a suspected weapons cache before a Marine company moved in to clear it. Attached to the element for this rotation at the specific request of the Rear Admiral, conducting a command observation assessment of forward DevGRU operations, was Navy Petty Officer Sloan Merritt. She had been transferred in 4 days earlier after their previous corpsman was medevaced with a fractured radius. She showed up at the forward operating base at 687 pounds of medical equipment on her back, a file that cleared every background check ever run on her, and the kind of face that made Petty Officer First Class Garrett Briggs look at Lieutenant Commander Brett Calloway and raise his eyebrows in a way that didn't require translation. Calloway ignored him. Sloan introduced herself to the team one by one. Firm handshake, direct eye contact. No attempt to fill the silence with explanation or apology for being what she was. She found a corner of the briefing room, sat down with her medical kit, and began a systematic inventory. Not because she needed to, she had inventoried it twice on the flight in, because she needed to see how these men reacted to a woman who didn't react to them. Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Dean watched her from across the room. He was the oldest member of the element at 41 with 17 years in special operations and the kind of weathered face that had stopped registering surprise about anything several years ago. He watched her sort through her kit with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times. He watched her hands specifically. He noted the absence of wasted motion. He noted the angle of her head as she checked each item, checking, but also listening, aware of the room around her without appearing to monitor it. He had seen that combination of awareness and stillness in exactly one other category of person. He filed it away and said nothing. The first operation was a reconnaissance insertion 3 kilometers south of the suspected cache site. Low risk, primarily surveillance, intended to establish line-of-sight observation positions before the main approach. Calloway assembled his element assignments that morning in the back of a Humvee with a terrain map folded across his knees. Merritt, he said without looking up, you're holding at the primary rally point with Holloway, support element. It was not an insult. Standard doctrine for an attached corpsman on a first operation with a new team. You didn't push an unknown asset into a forward position until you had baseline data on how they operated. Sloan said, yes, sir. Briggs, checking his M4 across the vehicle, glanced up. You good with that, Doc? He said it with a particular inflection that wasn't quite a question. Staying back where it's comfortable. Sloan finished retaping the grip on her sidearm. I'm good wherever you need me, Briggs. Just checking. Some people... I'm good, she said. The flatness in her voice was not anger. It was the conversational equivalent of a door closing. Briggs opened his mouth, read something in her expression that gave him brief pause, and went back to his rifle. Dean, 3 feet away, had watched the whole exchange. He turned back to his own equipment and allowed himself a small private adjustment of his prior assessment. The operation was textbook. They were back at the FOB by 0200, nothing fired, nothing compromised. Sloan spent the duration at the rally point monitoring the radio, maintaining the medical station, running her inventory for a third time. When Calloway came back through the checkpoint, she handed him a written sitrep on the condition of all personnel. None injured. Holloway, showing early signs of dehydration, recommended extra fluids before the next operation. He took the paper, read it, looked at her for the first time as something other than a logistical variable. He didn't say anything, but he kept the paper. The second operation went 3 kilometers further north and included a narrow passage through a section of dried riverbed that funneled the team into single file for approximately 200 meters. Too linear, no lateral cover. The only thing you could do was move fast and trust your flanks. Calloway put Sloan at position 4 in the column. Not at the back, not at the rally point. Position 4, Briggs noticed. He saved his reaction for later when the team was eating in the briefing room and Calloway was on a call with command. Interesting call today. Briggs said, not to anyone specifically. Putting the doc in the stack. Petty Officer Tucker Ashford, 24 years old and 18 months into his first deployment, looked up from his food. She did fine. She did nothing. That's the problem. She's a passenger in a stack. She's a liability. She kept pace, Dean said. Barely. Actually, Dean said, she was maintaining interval better than Holloway. Briggs set down his fork. Whose side are you on? The side of whoever does the job right. Dean picked up his coffee. You should try it. Sloan was at the far end of the table. She had heard every word. She ate her food and said nothing, and when she was done, she washed her own plate and went to check on the medical status of the team, which was required, and said nothing about the conversation, which was a choice. It was during the pre-operation equipment check for the third mission that Dean watched Sloan's hands for the first time with full attention. The team was running checks in the staging area. Dean's Barrett M82A1 was laid out on a table, 30 pounds of precision, engineering the rifle capable of reaching out 800 meters and beyond in the right hands. He had stepped away briefly to address a comms issue. When he came back, Sloan was standing near the table, not touching the rifle. Close. Then Holloway called to her about something, and she reached out to step around the table, and her left hand came down on the bipod leg to steady it as she passed an automatic gesture, the kind of thing you do without thinking when you are familiar with an object. And the hand that came down on that bipod adjusted its angle. Not by much, 3 degrees, maybe 4. But it was the right 3 degrees for the elevation of their target area, and it was done without looking, without measuring, without any apparent conscious thought. Dean stood absolutely still. Sloan moved around the table and went to answer Holloway's question, and Dean stood looking at the adjusted bipod for a moment longer, feeling the quiet arrival of a certainty he could not yet explain. He picked up the Barrett and carried it with him the rest of the evening. The third mission changed something. It was the deepest insertion yet, nearly 4 kilometers from the nearest coalition support position, moving through terrain that Dean had spent 40 minutes studying on satellite imagery and still didn't fully trust. The valley had too many angles. The ridge lines were too high. They were 90 minutes into the approach when Ashford stumbled. Not from the terrain. Something in his chest had gone wrong and his body had been compensating for it quietly for the last 40 minutes, and now it had run out of compensation. He went down on one knee, and Sloan was beside him before anyone else had processed what was happening. She put her hand on his neck first. Pulse check. Then she leaned in and looked at his face, the slight bluish cast to the skin around his lips, the shallow and asymmetrical breathing, the way his left side barely moved when he inhaled. Stop, she said quietly, and the column stopped. Calloway moved back. What is it? Tension pneumothorax. Air is trapped in his chest cavity. His left lung is being compressed. If we keep moving, he goes into cardiac arrest within 10 to 15 minutes. Briggs said he was fine an hour ago. He was compensating an hour ago. She pulled out a 14-gauge needle catheter. He's done compensating. I need 60 seconds and I need quiet. Calloway looked at the terrain around them, made a tactical calculation and said, "You've got it." Briggs watched her work with the expression of a man recalculating something he had already decided. She found the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line without hesitation. The needle went in. There was an audible release of pressure. Ashford gasped, and then his breathing deepened and evened out, and the color began returning to his face. 45 seconds from diagnosis to stabilization. Dean crouched next to Sloan as she taped the needle in place. He kept his voice below the wind. How'd you catch that? His gait changed about 40 minutes ago. Slight lean to the left when he breathed. I've been watching it. For 40 minutes. I wanted to be sure. I didn't want to stop the mission over a hypothesis. Most medics would have pulled the plug at the first sign. I'm not most medics. She closed her kit. Tell Calloway. That evening in the briefing room, something had shifted. Not in anything anyone said, in the way they held themselves when she was in the room. The way Briggs no longer looked to Calloway for confirmation before accepting her presence in the space. The way Ashford, sitting with a bandage on his chest and better color in his face than he'd had all day, watched her move across the room with an expression that was simple and complete. She had pulled him back from something he hadn't even known was coming. He would not forget that. The night before the fourth mission, Dean found her sitting outside the wire at the edge of the compound, looking out at the dark hills. He sat down beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. Your father was Marine Recon, he said. She was quiet for a moment. That's in my file. Not in your file. I know someone who served with him in the 90s. When I saw your name on the transfer order, I asked around. She kept her eyes on the ridge line. He died in Fallujah, she said. November 2004. I know. Dean paused. He was a hell of a shot. That's what they said. She didn't answer. He teach you. The question sat between them for a long time. He taught me a lot of things, she finally said. Dean nodded slowly. You adjusted my bipod yesterday. Her jaw tightened. Just a fraction. I bumped it when I was walking by. I was just... Sloan, his voice was not unkind. I set the bipod myself that morning. I know exactly what angle it was at. What you set it to was the correct adjustment for our target elevation and distance. That's not a bump. That's a calculation. She said nothing. I'm not going to make it a thing, Dean said. I just want you to know that I see what I see. He stood, looked out at the same ridgeline she had been watching. Tomorrow is going to be different from the others. Be ready for things to change fast. He walked back inside. Sloan sat alone in the dark for another 20 minutes. Her hands rested on her knees. Still, the fourth mission launched at 0300. They moved through the valley in two-element formation. The valley was narrow, maybe 60 meters wide at its widest point, with walls of pale rock rising 30 to 40 feet on both sides. At night, with PVS-14 night vision devices, it became a green-lit maze of shadows and thermals. They were 2 kilometers in when the grid coordinates proved slightly off. Not dangerously, but the cache site was 40 meters further east than the imagery suggested, which meant their approach angle was wrong, which meant the covering position Dean had planned for Henderson was wrong, which meant they were adjusting on the fly in a valley that did not allow for adjustments. At 0547, Sloan heard something that did not belong. A displacement of rocks somewhere on the ridge to the northeast, the kind of sound a boot makes when it finds the wrong stone. She turned her head toward it, slowly leading with her ears before her eyes. She did not reach for anything. Then on the south ridge, she saw a heat signature through the thermal monocular on her kit. Not an animal, the shape was wrong. She keyed the radio. Callaway, we have eyes on the south ridge, at least 3, elevated position. They've been up there a while, they're settled in. Callaway's voice came back low and immediate. How long do you think? Long enough to know we were coming. 1 second of silence. Then the RPG hit. It came from the north ridge, the south contacts were the backstop designed to prevent retreat. The blast hit 20 meters behind the element's rear position, close enough to throw rock and shrapnel across the valley floor. The PKM opened up from the south ridge a half-second later, then another from the north. L-shaped. Classic. They had the angles planned before the team's first footfall into the valley. Sloan moved through the team in the dark, accounting for each man, checking for injury by touch and training. Briggs had a gash on his forearm from flying rock. She taped it in passing without slowing down. Henderson was down on his right knee, right hand pressed to his shoulder, blood dark through his fingers. Entry wound, no exit. Fragment not around, embedded but not in the joint. He could move the arm if necessary, but he could not take the recoil of the Barrett. The PKM was still working the east side of the valley, keeping Callaway's element pinned. Dean appeared out of the dark and looked at Henderson. Then at Sloan. He's out. I know. His eyes went to the Barrett on the ground, then back to her. He ran the geometry, the angle, the distance, the wall protecting the gunner from every direction except one. A narrow window that existed only from a position 40 degrees east of where Dean currently stood, from where Sloan was. Merritt, he said, I know. I know the distance, she said. I know the angle. He waited. Her hands rested on her thighs, not shaking, not clenched. The way they had rested on a fence post in Montana at 11 years old, learning that stillness was not the absence of feeling, but the mastery of it. She thought about her mother in a house at the end of a gravel road 6,000 miles away. She thought about a promise made at a kitchen table in the first hard week of grief, when promises felt like the only thing solid enough to hold on to. She picked up the Barrett. She dropped onto her stomach and found the bipod position and settled the stock against her shoulder in one fluid motion, and the motion had no hesitation in it, and Dean saw that and understood exactly what it meant about the 5 years she was supposed to have spent not doing this. She put her eye to the scope. 840 meters. Slight crosswind. She ran the numbers the way her father had taught her, not math but feel, not calculation but calibration, something that lived in the body rather than the mind. She controlled her breathing. In for 4 counts. Hold. She pressed. The shot was off. 6 inches high and slightly left. She knew it before she heard the round hit rock rather than target. The wind had shifted in the fraction of a second between firing and arrival. It happened. She made the adjustment without panic, resetting her breathing, refining the target through the scope. The PKM fired again. She pressed. The second round hit. The PKM went silent. For 2 full seconds, the only sound in the valley was the echo of her shot rolling off the rock walls. Sloan held her position. She moved the scope to the south ridge, methodically checking positions. She reported their locations to Calloway in a flat, clear voice, and the team adjusted, and in the next 8 minutes, the south ridge positions were suppressed, and the team was moving toward the extraction corridor. She put the Barrett down before she stood up. She walked back to Henderson, checked his shoulder, updated the dressing, helped him to his feet. Briggs was standing 3 meters away watching her. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He said nothing. She shouldered her medical kit. "Let's move," she said, and they moved. That was the morning of July 9th, 2009. 5 days later, on the morning of July 14th, the worst thing that could happen to a 7-man element in Helmand Province would happen to this one. In those 5 days, the team changed. Not loudly, not with ceremony or the kind of explicit acknowledgement that men like these rarely offered. It changed in the way Calloway positioned her in the formation, in the way Briggs passed her the radio without being asked, in the way Ashford found reasons to be near whatever corner of the briefing room she was working in. She spent those days doing what she had always done, taking care of her people, watching, waiting. The fence post at the back of the property in Montana, the notebook in the workbench drawer. A father who had understood that the most important things cannot be said directly, but only placed carefully into a person's hands. Her hands remembered. The night before the 5th mission, Dean set a folder on the table beside her and left without a word. She opened it. It was a supplemental entry from a Marine Corps internal review. 1991. Operation Desert Storm, Kuwait. An incident involving Corporal Dale Merritt, Marine Recon, and a 3-man element pinned down during a reconnaissance push near the Iraqi border. She read it twice. The review was brief and dry and formal, and it managed, despite itself, to contain something true. Dale Merritt had been part of a 4-man element. A lance corporal named Webb had been shot during a firefight down in an exposed position with a femoral artery wound that required immediate intervention or he would not survive conventional extraction. Merritt had left his covered position. He had crossed 40 meters of exposed ground under fire. He had been shot in the process around through his left calf, and he had continued working, and Webb had survived, and both had been evacuated. The final line noted that prior to deployment, Corporal Merritt had made a documented personal commitment to his father, a retired Marine Master Sergeant, that he would not take unnecessary risks in the field. The events of March 9, 1991 constituted a breach of that commitment. She set the folder down. She sat with it for a long time. Her father had not given her an impossible standard. He had given her his own. He had done exactly what he would one day ask of her, and he had survived it, and then he had spent the rest of his life putting everything he had learned in those 40 meters into her hands, not as burden, as preparation. She thought about the letter. She went to her kit and took it out. She had carried it since the day she opened his effects, worn soft at the folds, the paper gone thin where her fingers always found it. Dale Merritt's handwriting was cramped and leftward, the writing of a man who had learned to hold a pen wrong and never corrected it because it worked fine that way. The letter was dated March 4th, 2003, 14 months before he died. Written from Kuwait on a night when he apparently could not sleep and had decided to do something useful with the hours between midnight and dawn. "Hey kid," he wrote about Kuwait, the heat, the sand and everything, a card game with 3 other guys from his unit, a dog that had found its way onto the base and adopted the sergeant major as its personal human, sleeping on his boots every night. He wrote these things the way he always wrote them, with enough specific detail that she felt she knew the people, which was his way of making sure she did. "Then I'm going to tell you something I haven't told your mother, and probably won't, and I need you to hold on to it the same way I taught you to hold a breath before a shot, without forcing it. Just let it sit. You're going to have a day. I don't know when. I don't know what it looks like. But you're going to have a day where everything I taught you becomes the difference between somebody going home and somebody not going home. I know this the same way I knew when you were 12 years old, and I watched you put 3 rounds through the same hole at 300 meters with a cold barrel that you were carrying, something not everyone gets to carry. When that day comes, use it. Don't think about the promise. Don't think about your mother. Your mother's promise was made by a woman who was afraid, and she's right to be afraid, because fear is what keeps the people we love alive. But fear is also the thing that will keep you standing at the edge of what you're capable of instead of crossing over. Use it. And then come home and call your mother, and she will be angry, and then she will understand, because she is the toughest woman I have ever known, and she understands more than she lets on. I love you more than I can say in a letter, and I've never been good at saying it out loud, so I'll leave it at that. Dad, at the very bottom in writing, slightly smaller and more deliberate, added, at a different moment on the same night. There's something else I've sealed with this letter. Small. Keep it safe. You'll know what it's for when you do. She folded the letter back along its worn creases and put it in the inner pocket of her jacket. She thought about the USB drive she had carried since the day she found it inside the watch that came home with his effects sealed in electrical tape the size of a thumbnail, the kind of thing you could carry for years before anyone noticed. She had not opened it. She had not been ready. She was beginning to understand that she would need to be. Outside, the compound was quiet. Someone was on radio watch. A generator hummed in the distance. The Hellman night was enormous and still full of the particular waiting quality that nights before operations always carried. Tomorrow was the day her father had written about. She could feel it the way she could feel weather coming in over the mountains at home. Not a thought, not a calculation, but a knowing that lived in the body before it arrived in the mind. She closed her eyes. She was ready. The briefing at 0500 on July 14th was shorter than usual. Calloway stood at the table with the terrain map and walked through the grid in the flat, methodical voice he used when he had already processed his own concern about a mission and was presenting only the operational facts. The gap between those two versions of his voice was larger than usual. The objective was a confirmed command node operating out of a compound 4 kilometers northeast of their current position. Intelligence placed 2 mid-level Taliban logistics coordinators at the site with a rotating security element of 8 to 12 fighters. The insertion would follow the northern ridgeline drop into the valley through a dry creek bed, and the element would hold observation positions while a strike package was coordinated overhead. Calloway said this was not a direct action mission. They were going in to watch and confirm, not to engage. He said it the way a man says something he needs to be on record, as having said. Sloan studied the terrain map. The valley was narrower than the one they had worked 5 days before. The creek bed approach was good for concealment, but it channeled the element into a linear formation for the last 400 meters before the observation position. The ridgeline above the compound had 2 obvious high points that a defensive element would use if they expected trouble. She studied those 2 points longer than everything else. Then she packed her medical kit in the order dictated by the frequency with which she expected to need each item under pressure. Tourniquet first. Hemostatic agents. The needle catheter. Everything else behind those. She added a second tourniquet to the outer pocket of her vest where she could reach it with either hand. Dean, checking his equipment beside her, watched her add the second tourniquet without commenting. She pulled on her jacket. The letter was in the inner pocket. She knew it was there. It was always there. At 0310 they moved out. The first 90 minutes were quiet. The ridgeline was hard going in the dark, loose rock, underfoot temperature in the low 50s before the sun came up, the kind of cold that settled into your joints and made you slow if you let it. She did not let it. Position 4 in the column. Behind Dean, ahead of Ashford. The Barrett was with Dean today, slung across his back. No one had said anything formal about the weapon assignment. It was simply understood that if it was needed, Dean would make a call, and the call he would make was now a known quantity. They reached the observation position at 0532. First light beginning at the eastern edge of the sky, pale and tentative. Calloway gave the signal to hold, and the team settled into their positions along the ridge. Sloan was 20 meters from the nearest covered position that gave a direct line of sight on the creek bed below. She stayed where she was and watched the compound. At 0549, she heard a safety being clicked into the off position on a weapon close enough to carry on the still morning air. Brief, small, completely distinctive. South ridgeline above the compound at the first of the 2 high points she had studied on the map. She keyed her radio once. The brevity code for contact imminent. Calloway responded with 2 clicks. Acknowledged. The RPG came from the east. It came from a position she had not anticipated, low from the valley floor, from a dry wash that ran parallel to the creek bed. The wash was masked by a low berm of earth that looked like a natural formation on satellite imagery, but was not. Someone had built it. Someone had spent time making the valley floor look like what it wasn't. The RPG hit 30 meters short of the primary element position, and the blast threw rock and dirt across the ridgeline, and Sloan was already moving. She found Holt at the edge of the blast radius. He was on his back with his right hand pressed to the inside of his right thigh and blood coming through his fingers at a rate that told her everything she needed to know in the first fraction of a second. Femoral artery. She dropped to her knees beside him. Right thigh, he said. His voice was steady. Feels like, I know what it is, she said. Don't move. Cat tourniquet out of the outer pocket before she finished speaking. She placed it high on the thigh, tightened, watched the bleeding, tightened again, not stopped yet. Another rotation on the windlass, the PKM opened up from the south ridge. The first burst went 6 feet over their position. The second burst walked toward them, and the rock next to her head took around and threw chips across her face, and she did not stop working. She turned the windlass one more full rotation and locked it and looked at the wound and then looked at Holt's face. Pale, breathing shallow but controlled. Pupils equal, still present. "You're stable," she said. "Don't move anything." "Two shooters on the south ridge," he said. "PKM is behind the left wall of the first structure. One spotter at the second high point." "I know," she said. She looked at the PKM position. 270 meters below 600 meters laterally along the valley. She had the angle, the distance, the position of the wall, and the gap through which the gunner was firing. The gap was narrow. The shot required going through it rather than around it, a technical problem with a specific solution. Dean was 40 meters north in a half-covered position trying to acquire the PKM target. The angle from his position was wrong. The wall was protecting the gunner from everything Dean could reach. She could see him running the calculation and coming back to the same answer. She keyed the radio. "Dean, I need the Barrett." A pause, 20 meters of exposure between us. "I know. Fire support is 8 minutes out." She looked at Holt. 8 minutes on the tourniquet was fine. 8 minutes with a PKM working the position was not. Calloway's voice came from 20 meters east, pinned down. "I've got 2 men who can't move under that fire." She looked at the PKM position. She looked at the angle. She looked at the gap in the wall. Then she looked at the ground 3 meters to her left. The outcropping. Low, almost flat to the ridge, a shelf of rock maybe 4 feet wide and 2 feet above the ridgeline surface. From that position, the valley dropped away at precisely the right angle. The wall below would not protect the PKM gunner from a round coming from that shelf because the shelf was above and east of the gun in a way the gunner had not accounted for in his setup. He had accounted for everything from the valley floor. He had not accounted for the ridgeline above him being occupied. The gap was real. The shot was there. She understood now completely what she had understood partially when she studied the map at 500 that morning. She understood it the way you understand something that has been building in you for a long time and has finally arrived at the surface. The shelf was 3 meters away. Her left foot was not going to reach it with her. She had known this before she took her position. She had chosen this position knowing what it would cost her because it was the only position from which she could do both things that needed to be done. Her father had crossed 40 meters of open ground in Kuwait in 1991 to reach a man who was going to die without him. He had been shot doing it, and he had continued, and Webb had lived. Then he had come home and spent the next decade putting everything he had learned in those 40 meters into his daughter's hands. She had always understood that the lesson was about courage. She understood now that it was also about math, about the cold, clear calculation that sometimes the only path to the right answer runs directly through the worst possible cost, and the only question that matters is whether you have the preparation to pay it and keep working. She had the preparation. She said to Holt, "Don't let go of the tourniquet." His hand tightened on it. "Go," he said. She moved to the shelf. She applied the second tourniquet to her own left leg first. High, tight. The way her father had taught her to do everything right the first time, no second chances. The windlass ratcheted through its rotations with the mechanical certainty of something that does not negotiate with the person using it. Then she worked. She used the surgical blade from the inner pocket of her kit. She worked with the same deliberate precision she brought to every clinical task, because precision was not a luxury here, but the only available mercy both for speed and for what came after. She was not a person who did things slowly when speed mattered. She did not make a sound. This is not a heroic detail. It is what happens when training has gone deep enough that the body performs and the mind holds the perimeter of the task, and the sound that would otherwise come does not come because there is no room for it in the architecture of what has to happen next. It took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. When it was done, she had both hands free. She picked up the Barrett. 30 pounds. She dropped onto her stomach on the shelf and found the bipod position and settled the stock against her shoulder, and the motion was completely without hesitation. She put her eye to the scope. 760 meters. The angle was steep enough to require a hold under. The gap in the wall was approximately 18 inches wide at her shooting angle. The PKM gunner had not yet registered the change in threat direction. She had perhaps 3 seconds. She took the breath. She held it. She pressed. The recoil drove into her shoulder. She held her position through it and watched through the scope, and the PKM went silent. She moved the scope to the South Ridge spotter position. The spotter was no longer at the wall. She keyed the radio. PKM is down. South Ridge spotter has pulled. Calloway's voice immediate. Copy. We're moving. She laid the Barrett flat on the shelf. She moved back to Holt. His hand was still on the tourniquet. His color was bad, but his eyes were clear. She got her hands on the wound and worked through a secondary assessment, confirming what the tourniquet had and had not addressed, checking for secondary damage below the arterial injury. She found none. The team maneuvered around her. The valley below went quiet. She kept her hands on Holt. The extraction was clean. The strike package arrived at the compound 11 minutes after contact ended, and the element was already moving north. Holt was ambulatory with support from Ashford on his left and Briggs on his right because the tourniquet had held, and she had determined that moving him was less dangerous than staying. She stayed close, monitored his pulse every 4 minutes, watched his color, his breathing, his gait. She talked to him because the conversation gave her continuous data on his cognitive status, and the data stayed consistent all the way to the extraction point. He spoke to her once, his voice directed only at her. That shot, he said, the PKM. Don't talk, save your energy. I know weapons positions. A pause. That shot shouldn't have been possible from where you were. She watched the ridgeline ahead. It was possible. 760, 760. He was quiet for a moment. One hand free, he said. You had one hand on me the whole time. She didn't answer. At the extraction point, Calloway stood beside her while they waited for the medevac. He had the expression of a man constructing a formal account of events from the raw material of what had actually happened, running the two versions against each other and finding significant divergence. He said, "Good work today, Merritt." It was the most he had ever offered. "Thank you, sir," she said. The medevac came in over the ridge, and Raymond Holt was loaded aboard, and Sloan stood at the edge of the landing zone and watched the helicopter rise into the pale morning sky. She stood there until the sound of the rotors faded. Then she allowed herself, finally, to sit down in the dirt. She sat in the dirt of Helmand Province in the early morning light, with her medical kit beside her, and the valley quiet behind her. And she looked at her hands, both of them resting on her knees, and thought about a gravel road in Montana, and a fence post, and an 11-year-old girl learning that the hands can carry what the mind is not yet ready to hold. She thought about her father writing in Kuwait at midnight, knowing. She thought about what he had trusted her with, and why, and whether he had understood when he wrote the letter, that the day he was describing might ask for something he could not have named even if he tried. She thought he probably had. She thought he had written the letter anyway. Dean found the problem 4 days later. He had been working through the operational timeline since the morning after the contact, pulling threads. The way he pulled all threads, quietly, methodically, without announcing what he was doing until he had something worth announcing. He had access through the FOB's intelligence system to the movement logs from the 48 hours preceding the operation, and he had been mapping them against the contact timeline. The pattern was there. The elements wrote, the specific approach corridor, the timing, the observation position on the ridgeline had been filed with the operations center 71 hours before the mission launched. Standard. The file was accessible to a defined set of people within the chain of command to the CIA liaison element attached to the FOB and to the intelligence section of the forward headquarters. The contact had included an ambush feature requiring advanced knowledge of that route. The dry wash position on the valley floor with its constructed earth berm had been prepared before dawn. Prepared meant time. Time meant someone had been in that valley with shovels and intent because they knew the route and the timing. They had known because someone had told them. Dean narrowed the access list to 9 names. Then he pulled the personnel records for the CIA liaison element at the FOB. One name appeared on both lists. Colonel Warren Pruitt, CIA operations officer, assigned as liaison to the forward element for the duration of Operation Khanjar. The only member of the CIA liaison team with both the access level required to read the route filing and the direct communication capability to move information outside the coalition network. Dean sat with this for a long time. He documented. He built the structure of the evidence with the same patience with which he had spent 17 years building everything else. When the structure was complete, he took it to Calloway. Calloway made 3 phone calls through channels that did not involve the FOB's primary communications infrastructure. The calls confirmed enough to establish that Pruitt had a history of operating in the gray spaces of intelligence work that left trails visible only to people specifically looking for them, and that at least 2 other incidents in the preceding 18 months had involved operational compromises attributed by formal review to other causes. Calloway looked at Dean across the table. This goes up through channels I trust personally. Nothing through Pruitt's network. Agreed. This takes more time than we have here. When we rotate out, it comes with us. It came with them. And it moved through the channels Calloway trusted, and it was received and documented and filed in the way that significant things are sometimes filed when the person they implicate is connected enough to make the formal process move at the speed of institution rather than the speed of urgency. In 2009, Warren Pruitt was a CIA operations officer. In 2012, he was a senior advisor. In 2016, he was deputy assistant director. In 2024, 15 years after a dry wash in Helmand Province, he was before a Senate committee being considered for the position of Deputy Director of National Intelligence. Calloway's file was still in the system. The system had not yet done anything with it. Before Dean's team rotated out, he found Sloan in the medical bay and gave her one final thing. He set a small evidence bag on the table. Inside was a USB drive, smaller than she expected, sealed with tape, the label written in her father's left-handed print. It came through official channels with his personal effects analysis, Dean said. A copy. The original was forwarded to your mother in 2004. You told me you had it. She looked at the PA for a long moment. Then she looked up at him. I haven't opened it, she said. I haven't been ready. I know. He paused. I think you might be now. She took the bag. She opened the drive that night alone in her bunk with a laptop borrowed from the communications officer. Her father's files were organized with the same cramped efficiency as his handwriting, dated, labeled, nothing wasted. 26 photographs, a 47-second audio file, a handwritten page of field notes. The photographs were low-resolution, shot from a distance, but the faces were clear enough. Her father had documented a series of meetings in Kuwait in 2003, a CIA officer meeting with a man her father had identified only as a known regional intermediary with connections to multiple militias. The CIA officer's face appeared in 11 of the 26 photographs. She pulled up Pruitt's official biography on the intelligence community personnel database. The face in her father's photographs and the face in Pruitt's official portrait were the same face 15 years apart. She sat with that for a long time. Her father had seen something in 2003 that he didn't have a name for yet. He had documented it with the methodical instinct of a Marine recon operator who understood that information you couldn't act on immediately was still information worth preserving. He had sealed it inside an ordinary object and sent it home to his family in an ordinary envelope because he had understood that the formal channels he would otherwise use might be exactly the wrong place for something like this. He had been right. He had been right about everything. She looked at the final photograph. Her father reflected in a vehicle window at the edge of the frame, clearly not the intended subject. He had been trying to document the meeting without being seen. In the reflection, he looked young and alert and slightly too thin, the way soldiers always looked in the field. He had died 11 months after taking this photograph. She closed the laptop. She lay on her back in the dark and looked at the ceiling of the bunk room and thought about the distance between 2003 and 2009, between the photographs her father had taken and the valley where his daughter had paid a price he could not have fully anticipated when he wrote his letter, and whether that distance was a tragedy or simply the shape of how things unfolded when the people responsible for accountability failed to be accountable. She thought it was both. She thought it was going to have to be fixed. Raymond Holt received the envelope on a Tuesday morning in rural Virginia. He was 68 years old, retired. He ran 5 miles every morning on a route through the edges of his property and back, and he was returning from the run when he found the envelope in the mailbox at the end of the driveway. No return address, his name in block handwriting. He opened it at the kitchen table. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a medical report from Bagram Airfield Theater Hospital dated July 14, 2009. Patient Petty Officer Sloan A. Merritt, USN. The second was a 40-page operational analysis bound with a binder clip signed by Marcus Dean at the bottom of the cover page. A second signature below it, added in 2023, belonged to a senior counterintelligence analyst at the CIA, whose name Holt did not know, but whose position told him everything about how long this had been moving through the system and how slowly. He read the medical report first. The clinical language was precise and specific and completely clear in its meaning. The admitting physician had documented the wound in careful detail. The injury to the left leg amputation below the mid-thigh had been assessed in the context of the surrounding tissue, damaged the absence of any fragmentation, Evidence, the nature of the incision, margins, the specific characteristics that distinguish this wound from blast injury, from ballistic injury, from any external trauma source. The admitting physician's notation at the bottom of page 3, wound consistent with surgical instrument, self-inflicted amputation, patient presented conscious and cooperative. Patient stated verbatim, I need both hands free. No evidence of psychological distress. Patient demonstrates full awareness of procedure and outcome. The psychiatric evaluation 3 pages later found Petty Officer Sloan Merritt to be fully oriented, cognitively intact, and operating from a rational and deliberate framework. The evaluating physician had noted her explanation with clinical neutrality. Patient reports choosing amputation as preferable to the 4 to 6 minutes required for alternative extraction from the entrapment, citing concern that this time would result in the death of a severely wounded colleague. The colleague was not named in the report. The final page was a suppression order, dated July 22, 2009, signed by Colonel Warren Pruitt Seapoin, a liaison operation Kunjar. It directed that the admitting physician's notation and the specific findings regarding the nature of the injury be removed from the official record and replaced with standard language of combat wound documentation. The official record would reflect Petty Officer Merritt sustained severe blast injury to the left lower extremity consistent with RPG fragmentation. The physician had complied, but the physician had kept a copy. Holt set the medical report down and opened Dean's analysis. He read it the way he had read operational documents for 35 years, systematically cross-referencing the timeline against the access list, checking the evidentiary chain at each node. The structure was solid. The conclusion was not speculative. Warren Pruitt had sold the route of a 7-man SEAL element to a Taliban logistics network in July 2009. 2 members of the primary element had not come home from that operation. A 26-year-old Navy corpsman had, in the aftermath of the ambush that resulted, made a surgical decision in the field that no one in the formal record had ever been told the truth about. And the man responsible for all of it was currently before a Senate committee being considered for the second highest position in the American intelligence community. Holt sat at his kitchen table in the morning light. He thought about the 17 seconds between losing consciousness from blood loss and regaining it on the helicopter over Helmand Province. He thought about the image that had persisted from those 17 seconds with the clarity of something branded. Rather than remembered a woman kneeling in the dirt with one hand pressed to his thigh and the other hand wrapped around a Barrett M8, 2A1, bringing the rifle to her shoulder from the ground in a single movement that had no wasted motion in it. None at all. He had tried to find her. In the months after his recovery, he had tried through every formal channel available to a man of his rank, and the channels had given him a service record that was clean and complete and contained nothing he did not already know, and nothing about the nature of her injury or the circumstances surrounding it. The official record said wounded in action. He had accepted this because he had no basis for questioning it other than a 17-second memory from the edge of unconsciousness. He had a basis now. He also had underneath Dean's analysis one final item. A USB drive, small and ordinary, with a handwritten and label. A note from Dean. This belongs to her. She knows what's on it, but you need to know it exists, and you need to hear what she tells you about it. He picked up the phone. She was at the clinic in Billings on a Thursday morning when her phone rang. The clinic occupied a building that had been a hardware store in a previous life and still had the structural bones of something built to hold heavy things. She saw veterans primarily not by policy, but by the nature of her network and the word that traveled among people who had been in difficult places and come back changed. She was finishing a dressing change on a former Army Ranger named Callahan when the call came through. Virginia area code. Not familiar. She let it go to voicemail. When Callahan left, she listened to the message. Holt's voice was measured and careful, the voice of someone who had spent decades choosing words because careless words had consequences. He said his name. He said he had received documents he needed to discuss with her. He said he would come to her if she was willing, and that he understood if she was not. She sat in the empty clinic for a few minutes. Then she called back. He came to Billings the following week. She met him at a diner 2 blocks from the clinic. He was older than she expected, which was irrational because she had known exactly how old he was. But age is a thing you know in the abstract until you see it in a specific face, and his face carried 15 years more than the man she had last seen being loaded onto a medevac. The years were in the face, not in the posture. His posture was still military, the physical residue of decades of training that the body does not simply release when the uniform comes off. He sat across from her and placed 3 items on the table. The medical report from Bagram, Dean's analysis. The USB drive with her father's handwriting on the label. She looked at the USB for a moment. She looked at him. "You didn't open it," she said. "It belongs to you," he said. "But I need you to tell me what's on it." She told him. She told him about the photographs, 26 of them taken in Kuwait in 2003 by a Marine recon operator who had seen something that didn't match its stated architecture and had documented it with the instinct of someone who understood that information worth keeping was information worth hiding well. She told him about the audio file, 47 seconds of a voice she had confirmed through comparison with later public recordings was Pruitt's. She told him about the field notes her father had written in his cramped left-handed print, detailing dates and locations and descriptions of a pattern he didn't yet have a name for. She told him what the cross-reference with Pruitt's deployment history produced. Holt was very still throughout. "He didn't know the name in 2003, she said. "He knew there was a pattern. He knew it was worth preserving. He was dead 11 months later. And you've had this since 2018. My mother passed that year. I found the watch when I was going through her things." She paused. "I've been watching Pruitt's career since Dean sent me his analysis in 2012, waiting for the right moment and the right person." Holt looked at the USB. "The right person," he said. 35 years of service, former DevGru commander, a rank and a record, and the kind of institutional weight that moves things that don't otherwise move. She looked at him steadily. "I couldn't go to a committee anonymously with a dead Marine's photographs in a 47-second audio file. It would have been buried in a week. I needed someone who couldn't be buried." He understood. "This is going to cost you something," she said. "Yes," he said. "Pension, clearances, reputation. Everything you built in 35 years gets examined under a different light the moment you attach your name to this." "I know. Are you ready for that?" He looked at her across the table, this woman who had been 26 years old in a valley in Helmand province and had made a decision in 3 minutes and 40 seconds that he had spent 15 years carrying the debt of without understanding what it actually was. He said, "I've been ready since the morning I woke up on a helicopter over Helmand province and remembered what I'd seen. I just didn't have the right thing to carry until now." He laid his hand flat on the medical report. "This goes to the committee. My statement goes with it. Your father's documentation goes with it. Pruitt's nomination gets the examination it should have gotten 15 years ago." She was quiet for a long moment. "There's one more thing," she said. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. Old, worn soft at the creases. "My father wrote this in 2003, she said. "He was right about everything in it." She did not push it toward him. She simply left it on the table between them. "I thought you should know the kind of man he was." Holt looked at the letter. He did not pick it up, but he read what was visible through the first fold, the cramped left-handed print, the date at the top, the way it began. "Hey, kid." He looked up at her. "His name was Dale Merritt," she said. "Gunnery Sergeant, Marine Recon. He died in Fallujah in November 2004. He was 41 years old and he was the best person I have ever known. And the man who sold that route in 2009 contributed directly to the circumstances that killed him 6 years earlier." She paused. "I want that on record." "It will be," Holt said. She picked up the letter and put it back in her jacket. "Some things you carry for yourself. The record could have the facts." The letter was hers. The Senate committee received Holt's statement and accompanying documentation on a Monday morning in October. By Wednesday, the confirmation vote for Warren Pruitt's nomination as Deputy Director of National Intelligence had been postponed pending review. By the following Monday, the Department of Justice had announced a formal investigation. Pruitt appeared before cameras on a Tuesday afternoon and denied everything in the specific and precise language of a man whose lawyers had been preparing that denial for some time. He was calm. He was credible. He called it a politically motivated attack by a disgruntled former officer and a woman with a personal agenda. He could not explain the wire transfers. He could not explain the 47-second audio file authenticated by 3 independent forensic laboratories. He could not explain why a CIA liaison officer had signed a suppression order on the medical records of a Navy corpsman whose wound had already been documented by the attending physician at Bagram. He could not explain why the root of a 7-man SEAL element had been in the possession of a Taliban logistics network before dawn on July 14, 2009. He resigned from the Senate 4 months later. The formal investigation continued. These things take time. They always do. The machinery of accountability is large and slow and resistant to urgency, and the people inside it are often as interested in managing the implications as in resolving them. But it was moving. It was moving in a way it had not moved in 15 years. Because a retired rear admiral had put his name on a document and sat before a committee and said in the flat and careful voice of a man who had spent 35 years telling the truth about difficult things, I was there. I know what I reported. I know what happened to that report. And I am telling you now, under my name and my rank and my record, that it was buried by the man you are considering for the second highest position in American intelligence. The committee had listened. Some debts are paid slowly, but they are paid. 6 months after Holt's testimony, Sloan Merritt was standing at the front of a room in a building at the edge of the VA campus in Billings, Montana. 18 folding chairs, everyone occupied. The people in them were young, mid-20s mostly, and they wore the particular alertness of people who had been places that made them sit forward when someone at the front of the room started talking, because they had learned that what the person at the front of the room knew might be the difference between someone going home and someone not. She picked up the marker and wrote on the whiteboard, "Heal when you can, fight when you must." She stood back and looked at it. Then she turned to face the room. "We're going to start with the femoral arteries," she said. "Not because it's the most common injury you'll see, because it's the one that doesn't wait for you to be ready, because it takes a person from stable to dead in 90 seconds if you don't know what you're doing, and knowing what you're doing means your hands already know before your brain has finished assessing the situation." In the third row, a young corpsman named Abrams wrote the words from the whiteboard into his notebook. She walked the room as she talked. She used the volunteers in the front 2 rows to demonstrate tourniquet application. She talked about timing. She talked about the difference between the textbook and the field, and the specific ways the field would try to make the textbook irrelevant and what you held on to when that happened. She talked about the difference between what your hands know and what your mind is ready to accept, and how in the worst moments of your life, your hands will be ahead of your fear if you have trained them properly, and how that gap between the hands and the fear was where the work was done. She did not talk about herself. She never did. The lesson was the lesson, and the person standing at the front of the room was only its delivery mechanism, and the only thing that mattered was whether it arrived intact in the people sitting in the chairs. The room was very quiet when she said these things. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It came through official channels from Army Human Resources Command, addressed to her full name and rank and current address, and it was 3 paragraphs of formal language that said in the particular bureaucratic grammar of military commendations that due to new information brought to official attention the record of Petty Officer Sloan A. Merritt's service on July 14, 2009, had been reviewed and updated, and that her existing Army Commendation Medal was to be replaced by the Bronze Star with valor effective immediately, and that a formal ceremony would be arranged at her convenience. She read it twice. She thought about Holt sitting in a Virginia farmhouse, opening an envelope that had no return address. She thought about Dean's 17 years in Special Operations building an evidentiary structure with the same patience he brought to everything. She thought about her father taking 26 photographs in Kuwait in 2003 with a camera hidden in a watch, because he had understood that the only reliable archive was the one you built yourself and kept close. She thought about all the people who had done the right thing slowly over years at a cost that varied and accumulated toward a resolution that was never clean, but was finally, after 15 years, something that could be called a resolution. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer of her desk at the clinic. Not because it didn't matter, because some things matter in a way that doesn't require display. The drawer already held Briggs' letter, and those 2 pieces of paper in that ordinary drawer were enough of a record for her purposes. The world could keep the ceremony. Garrett Briggs' letter had come 2 weeks before the Bronze Star notification. It was 2 pages. The first page was the formal cover letter for a curriculum proposal submitted to the VA proposal to develop Sloan's integrated combat medicine program into a standardized training module for corpsman and medic advanced certification to be piloted in 3 VA districts in the first year and expanded nationally pending evaluation. The cover letter was professional and precise and made a clear and well-constructed argument for the proposal's merit. The second page was handwritten. The handwriting was careful in the way of someone who does not often write by hand and wanted to get this right. It said, "I was wrong about you from the first day." Not wrong in the way of a man who lacks information, wrong in the way of a man who had information and chose not to use it because using it would have required him to adjust something he'd already decided. That's a worse kind of wrong, and I knew it at the time and I did it anyway. I'm not going to ask you to accept an apology for that. An apology is a thing you ask someone else to carry. I'm going to do something useful instead. This program is the right thing. I've seen what happens to young operators who go into the field without integrated training, and I've seen what you can do and what you can teach. And the distance between those two things is the distance between people coming home and people not coming home. I want to spend whatever time I have left in this community helping close that distance. If you'll let me help build this, I will. Whatever it needs, however long it takes. Briggs, she had read it the morning it arrived, standing at the clinic window, with her coffee going cold in her hand, and she had thought about a man who had said nothing in a valley when she had earned the right to hear something, and who had spent the intervening years, she did not know how many. She did not know what the years had cost him internally, arriving at the only apology worth anything. She had called him that afternoon. I got your letter, she said, a pause. And yes, she said, come help build it. He was there the following Monday. That evening, she called her mother. Carol Merritt answered on the second ring, which was how she always answered, and asked how the classes were going, because she had started asking about the classes the way she had never quite managed to ask about the deployments, with the genuine curiosity of someone who was proud of a thing they had been afraid of for a long time and had finally found a way to stop being afraid of it. They talked for an hour. Sloan told her about Briggs, about the curriculum proposal, about the 18 students in the Thursday class, and the way Abrams had written the words from the whiteboard without being asked. She told her about Holt and the committee and the investigation that was moving at the speed of institutions, but was moving. She told her all of it because she had started telling her mother all of it after the testimony became public, and there was nothing left to protect her from. And because Carol Merritt had turned out to be, as Dale had always said, the toughest woman he had ever known, and she understood more than she let on. Near the end of the call, her mother said, as she had started saying in the months since Holt's name appeared in the news reports, your father would have done the same thing. Sloan looked out the clinic window at the dark Montana sky. At this altitude, the stars were very clear, very numerous, the kind of sky you only got when you were far enough from everything else that the ambient light of the world didn't reach. I know, she said. That's why he taught me. She said goodnight. She stood at the window for a while after the phone still in her hand. The clinic was quiet around her. The whiteboard at the front of the room still had her writing on it from the morning session. Heal when you can, fight when you must, and she looked at it in the dark from across the room and thought about legacy the way her father had thought about it, not as the thing you do, but as what the thing you do becomes after you are done. The 18 students from Thursday's class would go into the field carrying something she had given them. They would give it to the people they saved. Those people would go home because of it. Some of those people would be fathers. Some of them would have daughters they would teach things to carefully over years, putting knowledge into small hands, with the understanding that the hands would know what to do when the moment arrived, even if the mind was not yet ready. That was the chain. That was how it worked. Not in the formal record, not in the certificates in the drawer, but in the accumulation of prepared hands moving through the world doing the work. She turned from the window. On her desk was a folder, the briefing package for a consultation Callaway had requested through a mutual contact involving a training assessment for a forward medical element deploying in the spring. She would read it in the morning. She would bring Briggs into the conversation by the end of the week. There was work to do, as there was always work to do, and the work was where the meaning lived, not in the finished products of it, but in the doing. She turned off the clinic light. She locked the front door. She walked to her truck in the parking lot under the Montana stars. Her blade prosthetic was quiet on the asphalt, her stride even, and unhurried the walk of someone who had stopped thinking about the walking and was simply moving the way you stop thinking about breathing once you trust your body to manage it. She drove home on the road that ran along the edge of the valley with the mountains visible to the west, the last light gone from their peaks. Now the high snow carrying a faint luminescence that had nothing to do with the stars and everything to do with the simple fact of elevation. She had grown up looking at those mountains. She had learned to read weather from them. She had stood at the back of a property at the end of a gravel road and looked at them over the barrel of a Remington 700, while her father stood behind her and said again, and she had understood even then without words for it, that what he was teaching her was not how to shoot. He was teaching her how to stay, how to hold your position when everything in you wants to move, how to keep your hands steady on the thing that matters most when the thing that matters most is the hardest thing in the room to hold on to, how to absorb the cost of a decision and keep working because the decision and the work are two different things and only one of them is finished when you make the choice. She had learned it. She had used it. She was still using it. She pulled into the driveway of her house, small on the east side of Billings, close enough to the clinic that she could walk when the weather allowed, and sat in the truck for a moment after turning off the engine, looking at the dark front of the house. She thought about her father's letter. She thought about the sentence near the end, and then come home and call your mother, and she will be angry, and then she will understand because she is the toughest woman I have ever known. He had been right. Her mother had been angry, and then she had understood. And then slowly over the years, since the testimony became public, and the story became something Carol Merritt could hold as something other than loss, she had become something Sloan had not fully anticipated and could not have predicted when she was 26 years old, making a decision in a field with a surgical blade and a tourniquet and 47 seconds left to act. She had become proud, not in the flag on the coffin way, not in the ceremony way, in the private and daily way of a woman who looks at her daughter across a phone call and understands finally and completely what her husband had known all along, that the thing he had put in their daughter's hands was not a burden and not a weapon and not an inheritance of grief. It was a way of being in the world that made the world better for the people in it, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Sloan got out of the truck. She went inside. She made tea in the kitchen and stood at the counter while it steeped, and she did not look at her earphone, and she did not turn on the television, and she did not fill the quiet with anything other than itself, because the quiet was where she did her clearest thinking, and she had always needed more of it than most people understood. She thought about the briefing folder on her desk. She thought about Briggs showing up Monday with a notebook and a willingness to work that was, she had come to understand in the months since, the most genuine thing he had ever offered her. More genuine than the letter even, because the letter was one moment and the showing up was every day since, and every day since was harder and more honest than any single moment could be. She thought about Abrams writing the words from the whiteboard without being asked, because he had already understood at 23 years old that the things worth keeping were worth writing down. She thought about a field in Helmand Province in the morning light and a helicopter rising into the pale sky, and the long distance between that morning and this one, not in miles and not in years, but in the slow accumulation of things that had been done right, and people who had been brought home, and knowledge that had been passed forward into hands that would use it. She drank her tea. She rinsed the cup. She went to bed. Outside, the Montana night settled into its full and enormous quiet, the stars doing what stars do over high country in October, which is simply being present in the darkness without requiring anything in return. The mountains were out there in the dark, the same mountains. They had always been patient and indifferent, impermanent, in the way that the things that outlast us are always patient and indifferent, impermanent. Her hands rested on the blanket. In the morning there would be work. There was always work. She had been taught to be ready for it. She was.